we're at the Fitchburg Art Museum at 25 Miriam Parkway, right in the center of downtown Fitchburg, here in Massachusetts. The museum is one of the oldest and most treasured institutions in northern Worcester County, with a collection of over 3,000 objects spanning 50 centuries. It was founded in 1925 by Eleanor Norcross. They have 14 galleries here with a diverse collection of American and European paintings, prints, drawings, ceramics, decorative arts, as well as Greek, Roman, Asian, and pre-Columbian antiquities. In addition to showing their permanent collections, the museum can organize many temporary exhibitions of works from other museums, private collections, and emerging and established contemporary artists. This summer, 2011, they will host the 76th Regional Exhibition of Arts and Crafts from the 23rd of June through September 4th. This annual juried show highlights many of the fine artists in our area. But today we're going to show you some of the works in a striking exhibition of African arts called Telling Objects, African art from the collection. And I am really delighted to have with me a colleague, Jean Borgatti, an art historian and educator who has selected these objects, curated the show, and done the research, which is so important to understanding what the exhibit has to tell us. Jean, thanks so much for being here. It's a pleasure. She's an amazing person. She wears many hats. But in this case, her background as an art historian, she really got her undergraduate BA from Wellesley College, where she studied modern art history with a concentration in modern art. And then she got her PhD from UCLA, where she studied non-Western arts. And her background and diverse experience is amazing. She spent a couple years at least in Africa. Well, tell us about your fellowships, for example.
Well, I spent 3 years in the early 1970s as a graduate student doing my research for my PhD. I was back in late 1970s on a postdoc for just a short period of time. And then I was back in 2001. I hadn't gone back for over 24 years, in 2001, 2002, 2003 on a Fulbright.
To Nigeria.
To Nigeria, to the area where I had worked as an unmarried woman, as a graduate student, both to teach and to continue research.
And the beauty of that, of course, is she could watch the changes in the art practices and the traditional dancing and so forth and so on.
Yes, well, certainly in 24 years there are a lot of changes in terms of the entire environment. The satellite TV, cell phones, internet connections, digital cameras, and so on, which accompanied me as opposed to the early 70s when it was like walking off the edge of the world when I went up country because of the difficulty of communication. Mm-hmm. The people were the same wonderful people, though, that I met when I first went there, and they were fully as cooperative, helping me to understand the kinds of things they were doing and the kinds of changes that they had made.
So one of the important things about being an art historian is you have to do the research and understand the objects. And then the other parts of being an art historian are to get that information and that new understanding out to the public through either publication or through teaching.
So you've had, in this case, through exhibits.
Through exhibitions. You've done quite a few wonderful exhibits too, I know.
Masks actually are the faces of spirits. And all masks, or all masquerades, are personified spirits, but their function can be many and varied. So they can be highly ritually oriented and religious, but they also can be entertainment. And so it really depends on the culture, it depends on the situation, it depends on the community, and so on.
Isn't that interesting? You know, I never thought about it so much, but the festival dancing and it has the concept of enjoying that religious festival. You know, it's a celebration almost.
Okay, but again, it's not only religion in the sense that many of the masquerades come out for social occasions but there is always and they derive their authority from being the faces of spirits or being personified spirits. So if the function is actually entertainment, that's really what the function is. Sometimes the function is commemorative, to commemorate a specific ancestor or ancestors in general, and then there is a little more religious framework in which they act. But often they are highly enjoyable, even if they are highly religious or highly sacred.
So social functions like deaths and births and weddings and so forth and so on.
People want to provide masking in those contexts. Even today, when many people are both or are either Christian or Muslim, particularly in the area where I worked, where we had both of those major religious groups were well represented. If there is a major community celebration, such as the winning of a court case over boundary disputes, they will still bring out the masquerades as part of the general celebration. Even though and the point is simply to celebrate community in that case.
Well, we're standing in front of a very interesting mask right here. Could you tell us about this one?
Okay, this is a mask from the Senufo culture, people who live in Ivory Coast, what is now Ivory Coast. The mask itself is a wooden helmet mask, which would be actually worn diagonally. So the helmet part, which you see here, is sitting on top of the head. The dancer would be looking out through the mouth, and then the face would be covered, or well, in part, the shoulders and body would be covered by a costume. But it represents a composite animal, and many of the animals in it have roles in the mythology of the people. The chameleon is one of those animals that indicates seniority. The horns and so on of the antelope suggest speed and power. The great mouth of this is almost crocodilian in some way, even though it's broad, again suggests power. The tusks are those of the warthog.
Yeah, they're
again,
really
another power.
Big, long teeth inside there. Yeah.
So it's a composite, and it was used actually as part of the funeral celebrations for important men or women who died in the community. That the masquerades help move the body actually to the burial site, and their companionship helps the soul of that individual or the spirit of that individual moved along his or her journey to the next world.
So the ritual of the community gathering and being involved in the ritual and transporting the body is the function of it. Well, you know, one of the things I found really interesting when looking at the show, Jean did such a terrific job on the labels here. And you know, the whole point is that we understand other cultures through understanding the objects. And you know, we tend to see this as an art object on the wall as it hangs vertically. But when I looked at her label here and saw the photograph of the mask being worn on top of the head, then you realize how the art historian's understanding of the use of the object really has an impact on how we read the object and how we see it. So she's done a terrific job on the labels. You can it's like taking a course in African art objects. So
well, you know, I think there are two ways to understand, at least two ways to understand these objects. One is to look at them from a Western art object viewpoint, in which we have done. We have isolated the objects so people can look at them. So you can look at them, so you can contemplate them, you can look at the form, you can appreciate the form. Aesthetically. But also to understand that there's a way these objects were presented in their own cultures, which is, in the case of masks, part of larger aesthetic constructs which involve costume, which involve music, movement, celebration, the interaction of members of the audience and so on. And so I have tried to incorporate photographs on all of the longer labels so that people who come into the exhibit will have some sense of how these objects were seen in their own cultures, as well as how we want to see them in our culture. And so we have the best of both worlds.
Imagine you could say that about Christian iconography too, where the way we see it as an art object is quite different from when the bishop stood in front of it and, did the ritual.
Yes.
Well, let's move on to another group of objects.
Okay.
How did the Fitchburg Art Museum acquire these objects?
Well, about 3 years ago, or over the past 3 years, starting about 3 years ago, we've received almost 400 objects from three specific donors, from William Teal, who was the primary donor at the MFA, from the Genevieve McMillan Reba Stewart Foundation in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and from Dwight and Anna Heath, who are from Providence, Rhode Island. And we've acquired now this critical mass, which is also attracting other objects as well, which is very exciting, to enable us to fulfill our mission here at Fitchburg, which is to educate.
That's right.
Through art.
A lot of the mission, right from the very beginning in the Norcross days, was educating and bringing art to the community.
And so this exhibit is in many ways a preview of the collection that we have, a small fraction of the objects that we have. All of them are certainly not masterpieces. In fact, most of them are not masterpieces, but they're good representative pieces of their types from their cultures. And they can be used to teach about those cultures, as well as to teach about art in our own culture. Because
Yes.
African art, of course, was one of the catalyzing arts for the early modern painters and sculptors in Europe.
Yeah, and when I look at these masks, there's such a diversity of masks here. Are these from many different regions?
Yes, you have to remember Africa is a continent, not a country. There are 53 countries in Africa, over 3,000 ethnic groups in the continent.
More countries than states,
Right.
Think about it.
But over 3,000 ethnic groups. So they all have their own ways of doing things. Although much of what you see here, the wood carving, comes from West and Central Africa, and many different ethnic groups spread across that area.
And one of the things I always like to point out is that distortions, deliberate distortions, are vehicles for expressing otherworldly ideas. Like you say, they represent spirits, so those distortions are actually very significant and telling.
Yes, African artists basically tell you what to look at by dramatizing what is important, usually making it larger than life in terms of its relation to the human body.
Talk a little bit about the portraiture idea, because I know you've done a lot of research in that.
Yes, portraits in Africa have as their signature element naming, not likeness. In part because African art itself is a generalizing tradition, an idealizing tradition, so that every wart and mole is not supposed to be represented, but rather a general image of the person who is being memorialized. Most of the portraits in Africa are memorial portraits. But you can have as well totally symbolic portraits. And these are something we understand a lot better now, given contemporary portraiture in the Western world, where likeness has come under attack, you might say, as the most important element in determining a person's personality.
Well, also, like when you think about something like St. George, nobody knows what he looked like, but everybody recognizes St. George because he's killing the dragon. So isn't it similar in the regard that the mask would have a generalization of certain recognizable aspects that people would say, well, that's the name of the spirit?
But we're talking about names of spirits and the names of individuals who are commemorated are different,
Yes,
two different
you're right.
things.
You're absolutely right.
But in any case, sometimes, yes, the portrait itself is an idealized image of a successful person. If it's based on the human form, sometimes I said they're symbolic and they're not based on the human form, but the way it's recognized is by the name, by the people who accompany it, or the place where it's sited in terms of the family. You remember, these artists were serving much smaller communities than our global artists are today, so that people knew who made what, who was represented by a particular object, and so on.
Well, it's interesting to look like some of these are quite naturalistic. And, you made a very distinctive point, because I'm running the portraits and masks together, and in some regards, there's quite a big difference, the portrait being an individual. But this is a very naturalistic one that you might see, or some of these very, very abstracted and stylized, and you could see how the early modernists like Picasso would have looked at these forms and recognized the power of the shapes and relationships of rugged, expressive quality. Tell us about this mask from the Congo. I love it.
Well, it's a very cubist mask, you might say, with this very aggressive jutting forms. And that's one of the points of this show, is that not only do the objects tell stories about their own cultures, but they can sometimes tell stories about Western culture. And as I said before, modernism and African art are flip sides in some ways of the same coin because of its catalyzing effect.
So meaning that in the 19th century, Africa began to open up, and artists in Europe saw works of art that they had never seen before.
Well, African objects began coming into Europe. Africa has always been open.
Yeah, well,
Europe is the one that was closed. But in any case, contemporary artists have been critical of some of the early modern artists because they did not acknowledge Africa as a source of inspiration. Picasso wasn't until 1940 that Picasso actually acknowledged that he had been inspired by, or that African art had worked as a catalyst with his changing formal conception of the human body. But in some of these contemporary artists who have reflected on this, Fred Wilson, who is one of them, he did something using a reproduction of Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, which is considered one of the first major Cubist images. And he put a mask just like this one on the most African face in the composition, and then he entitled it "Whose Rules?" As Picasso followed whose rules? And obviously he followed African rules. And he followed African rules because he saw what the African artists were trying to do. I'm not saying that he copied African art, but he figured it out.
I think it was just a revelation to the artists at that time, because they were questioning, the function of art in a culture. And with photography and other things, they began to wonder about is replication of images what art is about, and they realized, no. And then bingo, they began to see other kinds of art which had great impact for them. And they realized that art had this potential to communicate in many different ways. And I think was very moved by that.
Yes, and so as I said, he figured it out.
And even in contemporary culture, it's interesting to see artists like, I know you have some labels concerning contemporary artists like Faith Reingold, who uses inspiration, I would say, from African art. And she's a very famous contemporary American African artist, but definitely influenced by the African tradition, wouldn't you say?
Yes, but I think she was also, like many postmodern artists, critical of the European modernists for not acknowledging the role of non-Western art in helping them break through the constraints of naturalism, I guess you would say.
Yes. Well, there are many contemporary artists we could mention. Let's look at some of the other objects. I love this fabric. It kind of reminds me of contemporary minimalism, or this abstract geometric patterning. Now, what is this textile we're looking at?
We're looking at a piece of raffia cloth from the Kuba culture, who are located in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the raffia cloth has been made in this area, we know, certainly since we have documented examples that have been collected from the 16th century onward, because the Portuguese arrived by sea and they brought pieces back to the Vatican.
Wow.
And they were described actually as fine as the finest linens that were made in Europe.
And I did not know it in all these years that raffia is actually from the palm leaf. Is that correct?
Yes.
And
well, there are different sources.
Yes.
I mean, different fibers come from different parts of the palm tree, but it's the raffia palm. It's not every palm tree.
But it's the leaf?
The leaf is certainly part of it, but they also take the things from the bark as well, for other things.
Yeah. So then they would bead it, and who did the actual weaving? And
men actually do the weaving, but women do the embroidery. So it's really a combined effort of men and women.
And so how was this object used?
This particular one would have been part of a woman's skirt. The Kuba are very interesting in that they have a highly stratified society, royalty and people underneath them, and then common people. And the way you showed your status was to have the finest things, the finest cloth, the finest domestic implements, the finest brass-made objects, and so on. And what I find particularly interesting is that these patterns, which you find so attractive and minimalist, are an aesthetic, a way of breaking up the surface that we see not only in the cloth and the flat embroidery, we see it in plush embroidery, we see it in carved designs on wood. We also see it actually in the scarification patterns that in the 19th century were worn by Kuba women across their abdomens.
So they actually used the same kind of geometric patterning in the scars of the scarification.
Right, but across the same aesthetic was applied to every surface. Mm-hmm. So the body was a canvas just as the cloth was a canvas.
And so we were talking about different functions of the art. This was definitely for status and decorative pleasure, I might say, whereas others had other significance as well. Now, one of the reasons we were talking about a lot of the African arts that were produced centuries ago not surviving, and you said a lot of times these kinds of cloths would be buried with the individual because they took it with them, but also the climate?
Well, in part, the climate, certainly in parts of West and Central Africa, those are the areas where we do have tropical forest. So it's damp, humid, and so on. And if objects were made of organic materials like cloth, made from the fiber of the raffia palm, wood, and so on, they deteriorated and had to be remade.
And with insects,
insect damage as well, and rot and so on.
Exactly.
But you also but there was a benefit to this because it meant that artists continued to have a source of income and work, because objects had to be remade periodically.
Yeah.
You make one to replace one that is deteriorating.
This is lovely, lovely. These are a very different group of objects. Looks like stools. What are these?
They're basically functional objects from different parts of West and Central Africa. Stools, headrests. There is actually a bed over on the long pedestal. But even though they're functional objects, they also had other uses. The stools for the Ashanti, this small one here at the top, and this small seat, both also served as memorials for the person who used them. And so they were maintained in family shrines after a person's death. And it was kind of like keeping a list of the important members of your family.
So by looking at the stool, you would remember, well, that's Joe's stool.
Well, yes, and then you have to remember, these were cultures that did not maintain their records in written form. So they had objects that catalyzed memory.
Good point. Yeah.
And so that's what these,
So
in some
each
cases,
object
work.
would represent that individual whom they would keep amongst them because of his stool.
Well, in certain cultures, the stools did that. That was not
Yeah.
true of all cultures, but it was certainly true in the Ashanti and the Baule. This is a Baule stool, and the top one there is the Ashanti stool.
And were not stools also a signifier of importance in the village community, or in some instances? Or?
Yes, stools were also seats of power, like thrones. And indeed, it depended on the culture and on the political system and so on.
Very interesting. Okay. Well, these masks are very different. I am amazed when I look at these to think those are worn over the face.
Right.
With that huge top going up. How does the dancer possibly maneuver with those?
Well, for one thing, Africans historically, and it's still even today, move a lot of things by carrying them on their head. So they've developed both good carriage and very good balance for this sort of thing. It's also fastened quite carefully onto a costume so that it doesn't move
so it would be
around.
tied.
So it would be tied to a full raffia
But still, you
costume.
have quite a neck muscle.
Yes, well, that's what happens. Africans actually can carry up to 80% of their body weight on their head because there was a study done at the University of Ibadan back in the 70s on this. And because but you start when you're little, so you're developing those neck muscles and the back muscles and so on over many years.
Interesting.
And practice. They also don't have the oldest people dancing these, or the youngest people, the people who have strength and
There's a
skill.
wonderful film here that you show the dancing, and it's amazing, the leaps and jumps and spins, and it's very acrobatic dancing.
I would agree
with
with that.
Well, it's been a wonderful experience looking at these objects with you. And thanks again for sharing your insights with us. I really enjoyed the show tremendously. You did a marvelous job with your research. And thanks again for joining us. And come back and join us again next time for another edition of Arts and Ideas.
Thank you, Susan.